the police, the prison system, the law. It's no secret that these institutions intentionally crush and terrorize Black and oppressed people within the U.S. But the brutal violence the U.S. military inflicts on colonized Black and brown people
is often hidden from our view. Even though the U.S. military is the largest and most expensive of any country, by far.
We have new, beautiful equipment that comes along with $2.5 trillion in spending, all made in the USA.
The U.S. military has literally divided the earth into 11 areas of responsibility, each patrolled by a different command.
The U.S. Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM, polices one of these areas of responsibility. The SOUTHCOM region covers 15 million miles
and represents about 1/6 of the landmass of. Headquartered in Miami, U.S. Southern Command includes 32 countries, 19 in Central and South America and 13 in the Caribbean.
And that's not to mention 16 U.S. colonies like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which don't have political independence as sovereign states and are not represented in the U.S. government.
SOUTHCOM grew out of the U.S. military occupation of Panama in the first decade of 1900. This was when the U.S. government built the Panama Canal to secure trade routes for its elite and business class. It was established during World War II, originally under the name Caribbean Defense Command.
And formalized the government's control over the Caribbean, which had begun decades prior during the Panama invasion. Now, SOUTHCOM has at least 4 bases in the region, including Guantanamo Bay in Cuba.
The U.S. military uses its bases in Honduras and El Salvador as access points to reach other strategic locations, such as Nicaragua, Venezuela and Colombia, and Guatemala.
Joint exercises and military-to-military contact programs between the United States and regional militaries are a major aspect of SOUTHCOM's activities.
While SOUTHCOM says these military operations promote security cooperation,
we built that team, we built that camaraderie,
build regional partnerships, and strengthen democratic principles. In reality, SOUTHCOM programs have supported dictatorial regimes and militarized governments in the region.
Like that of Papa and Baby Doc, who ruled Haiti in the late 1950s until the mid-1980s.
And the Colombian government, which right now is killing indigenous and African-descended human and land rights activists.
These governments do the bidding of the U.S. by economically exploiting their own country for the benefit of U.S. corporations and by squashing popular rebellion.
As natural disasters and political crises, including the U.S.-led war on drugs, escalated in the 1990s, SOUTHCOM activity increased.
Good evening. This is the first time since taking the oath of office that I felt an issue was so important, so threatening, that it warranted talking directly with you, the American people. All of us agree that the gravest domestic threat facing our nation today is drugs. Tonight, I'm announcing a strategy that reflects the coordinated, cooperative commitment of all our federal agencies.
Every year, SOUTHCOM uses humanitarian assistance exercises and disaster response efforts as military training platforms.
But instead of stemming drug flows and feeding the poor, SOUTHCOM's true goal is to destabilize socialist countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, as well as disrupt Latin American and Caribbean nations' relationship with Russia, China, and Iran.
The absolute urgency with which we have to maintain our competitive edge in this region, increasingly contested strategic space in the global competition with China and Russia. And we do maintain our positional advantage here. However, that advantage is eroding, and it's challenging our ability to maintain the favorable balance of regional power directly called for here in this hemisphere in the National Defense Strategy.
The Black Alliance for Peace stands against the growing influence and power of SOUTHCOM and its ever-increasing militarization of the region.
We demand the end of SOUTHCOM and call for a zone of peace in Latin America and the Caribbean, in which the people's right to self-determination is realized.
And conflicts between nations are resolved peacefully. No compromise, no retreat.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is the first webinar of 2025. A greeting and welcome to the Black Alliance for Peace, Haiti America team's first webinar of 2025, Combating Imperialism, Defending Sovereignty, Zone of Peace in Haiti and the Americas. My name is Claudia O'Brien Moscoso, co-coordinator of the Haiti Americas team and contributor for Black Agenda Report based in Lima, Peru. I have the honor of moderating today's panel. Thank you for joining us for this critical webinar exploring the multifaceted tools of imperialism and their impact on the Americas. This discussion will unpack how sanctioned soft power mechanisms like the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, and USAID, militarization, and global banking systems are weaponized to uphold US power and undermine sovereignty across the region. Panelists will analyze the historical and contemporary roles these tools play in destabilizing governments, fostering dependency, and suppressing popular people's movements for self-determination, highlighting resistance strategies and pathways to combat imperialism and defend sovereignty while building solidarity among peoples and nations in the Americas. Since even before the days of the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, the US has had a colonial, expansionist, and imperialist relationship with the rest of Nuestra America. For us in the Haiti Americas team of Black Alliance for Peace, we recognize Haiti to be the key to the liberation of the rest of the region. So much so that its role has been recognized as such by US politicians throughout history. In the Monroe Doctrine and its application to Haiti, former governor of West Virginia, William A. McCorkle, wrote in 1914, "Let us consider, as briefly as possible, the governmental and social condition of the Republic of Haiti, so importantly located as it is, and the probability of its becoming a menace to the fundamental principles of the Monroe Doctrine. It is important for us to see if it offends against the peace and safety of this country. It is practically part of the shoreline of our republic and is in control of the avenues of our greatest routes of commerce to the world and lies at the mouth of the canal, which has cost us untold sums of money. The question is vital to us as to whether the condition of this island, so important to us, will ultimately lead to interference on the part of European nations or compel us in order to preserve the peace and safety of our country, to provide, by some means, that its present condition be changed, and instead of being a menace to the peace and safety of our republic, it may become a blessing to the world and a protection to the commerce, which will be the greatest ever witnessed since the keels of mankind's ships began to cleave the water in their quest for knowledge and riches throughout the world." Since the evacuation by the French, Haiti has been a land of seething revolution, despotism, and crime against religious and governmental law. With the forms of a free government, yet it has been a despotism unrivaled in its disregard for human rights. A general of a department with a raggedy army of banditti behind him who, by blood and rapine, seizes control of the government, oftentimes without the pretense of the forms of an election, has generally furnished the hard phantasmagoria, which I had to look up, which since the French evacuation has posed in the Haitian Republic under the guise of free government. And so we recognize Haiti today as the Palestine of the Western Hemisphere, as they themselves and Palestinians alike have engaged in. Today, on the first day of the ceasefire, a historic victory for the Palestinian resistance and its popular cradle, the Palestinian people, we must remind ourselves that this is only a step in the struggle for the liberation of Palestine. The US, West, and its Zionist colonial outpost tried to separate the brave Palestinian resistance fighters from the Palestinian people, but these last 15 months of horror have laid bare the logic of Western white supremacy and their commitment to the ethno-supremacist Zionist state. Whether in Palestine or in Haiti, the US and the collective West have used both as a testing ground of US imperial control. Haiti and her people have been used as a place to practice methods of chaos to destabilize the country so that it can stay reliant on unsustainable entities, foreign government missions, and Western-funded NGOs that are a part of the efforts to crush the self-determination of the Haitian people or of the Palestinian people. Today, we are joined by an esteemed panel of speakers to discuss imperialism in Nuestra America and the multifaceted ways it is carried out. Before I introduce folks, I wanted to just remind our listeners that, especially for anyone that needs interpretation, that on the bottom, there should be a globe. Yeah, you can click in there, and if you need interpretation, you can, whichever language you need, whether Spanish or ASL. So our first speaker that I have the pleasure of introducing, Nina Farnia. Professor Nina Farnia is a legal historian and anti-imperialist activist. Her book on modern US imperialism and anti-imperialist resistance and dissent is forthcoming with Stanford University Press in winter 2026. She is a founder of the International People's Tribunal on US imperialism, sanctions, blockades, and economic coercive measures. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Nina Farnia.
Hi, y'all. I can't start my video. Okay, there we go. Thank you all very much for inviting me. It's a fortuitous moment to be here, both because of the ceasefire and because of what's coming in the next. I think the ceasefire sort of marks a new era in global politics, and so it's a very fortuitous moment to be here. I also am very grateful for the video that you shared. That was an excellent video, and also makes it much easier, I think, for all the speakers. So I did a talk at the Caribbean Studies Association in the summer called How the Caribbean Made the World. And so I'm borrowing, I'm not going to read today, but I'm borrowing some of the ideas that were in that talk for this presentation. But so much has changed since that talk that it wouldn't even make any sense for me to read it. That talk was organized into past, present, and future. So I'm going to do something similar today, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the past. I'm going to talk mostly about the present and the future. And I know that the esteemed panelists here have a lot to say, I think, about the present and the future as well. So we live in what I call the white world order. And this era began approximately 600 years ago with the advent of racial slavery and colonialism. And it sort of coincided with the Spanish Inquisition as well. And so a lot of the methods that were used, the sort of super violent methods that were used to implement the Spanish Inquisition then spread throughout the world through European colonialism and European imperialism. On the other hand, we're also living in the era created by the Haitian Revolution. And the people in this group can speak about the revolution much better than I can. But what we're seeing in Palestine today, for example, the victory that we're literally witnessing on our phones, that is a descendant of the Haitian Revolution. And I mean, we could talk for days about it, but specifically in the ways that you have a completely impoverished and besieged people who were subject to a genocide fight and win in a way where they have actually changed the world. Al-Aqsa flood has now changed the world. The Haitian Revolution did so on a much grander scale at that historical moment. So we're still living in this era where there are these two competing forces that are incommensurable forces. On the one hand, you have the white world order. On the other hand, you have the revolutionary struggles of the global majority seeking freedom and also control of their own land and resources. What I want to focus on today is the U.S. That's what I've been asked to focus on, and but how we should think about the modern U.S. in the contemporary moment. There's a, I think there's a tendency to think of the U.S. as a dysfunctional nation state, right? Sort of like the bad cop, right? There's a good cop and the bad cop. The system is not the problem, it's the cops. I think there's a tendency to think of the US in that way as well. Even if people are critical of US imperialism, the position is that if the US just behaves like a normal nation state, we'll all be better off. Now, that may very well be the case, but the problem with that is that that's not possible for the United States. The United States is an empire through and through. Its structures, its mechanisms, the way every aspect of this society is structured, from the taxation system to the military to the what we call federalism, right? And those of us that are US, think about the US a lot, we know about the balance of powers between the state or local powers and the feds, the federal government. That is an aspect of its imperialism, its continental imperialism. So imperialism is baked into the North American cake. And there's no way to transform this imperialist society and system of governance and economy into, quote unquote, a normal nation state. And in this way, it's distinct from the European nations. A lot of the European, not all, but a lot of the European nations, they pre-existed imperialism. They were spawned out of other forces of evil like feudalism, but they pre-existed imperialism. The United States did not pre-exist imperialism. It was produced through mechanisms of imperialism like settler colonialism and racial slavery. So this is why, and I know this crowd doesn't need to hear this really, but it's worth mentioning. Social democracy is not going to work here. The AOC project, I mean, she's not really a social democrat, but she's more closer to fascism. The AOC project, the Bernie project, that's not going to work here. The capitalists are not going to allow the redistribution of resources necessary to even uphold a social democratic project. That's just not going to happen. So what is likely to happen is the balkanization of the empire, the balkanization of this land. So if we view this land as part of the continental imperialist project, right, from sea to shining sea, border to border, right, north to south, it's likely to eventually become balkanized. And I think we're already seeing aspects of that or dimensions of that, right? Like on the one hand, you have a DeSantis, on the other hand, you have a Gavin Newsom, both horrible, but in very different ways. Their relationships to capital are very, very different. Their relationships to diversity, right? Integration of oppressed peoples into the empire are very different. And so we're already seeing dimensions of this emerging balkanization. The government, the US government, has been pretty masterful, especially through the system of federalism, at holding it all together. But I don't think that it has the economic fundamentals to continue to do that over the long term. And I also don't think the people are into it anymore. And it certainly doesn't have I don't think in the long term it's going to have the military capacity to hold it all together. And this is precisely why we have a ceasefire now. Trump said as much. Trump said, he actually told Netanyahu, he said, I want Palestine quiet. Well, he said Israel. I want Syria and Iraq and the rest of the countries in the region to quiet down because I need to concentrate our resources here. He actually said that. And I think when he says things, he has proven, even when he says the most outlandish, crazy things, he has proven to be serious and to actually be able to execute many of the outlandish and crazy things that he has said. So I'm going to talk about briefly what I've written about, which is the 4 policy pillars of US imperialism. Obviously, imperialism is an economic dynamic. It's the extraction of resources and land and labor from global South nations largely, and the peripheries within this land in order to uphold capitalism, which needs it's a never-ending basis of resources to survive. But as a legal thinker, I also think about the political aspects of imperialism, how it's actually executed on a day-to-day basis. And so what I identify as the 4 policy pillars of imperialism are militarism, sanctions, multilateral and unilateral coercive measures, foreign aid, so USAID and everything else that comes out of the foreign aid, the NGO system, and then dollar dominance, what a lot of people call dollar hegemony. I actually call dollar dominance. Dollar dominance, all of these things are sort of they're not doing as well as they used to be, right? U.S. militarism it's certainly struggling in the Eastern Hemisphere. The sanctions apparatus was largely undermined by the imposition of sanctions on Russia. It's still alive and well, but a lot of nations throughout the world have learned mechanisms to bypass it. Dollar dominance is again, still alive and well, but countries are now finding ways to use their own local currencies for trade. The majority of the trade between Russia and China is in their local currencies. Iran just established a trade system with Russia in their local currencies. And all nations throughout the world have reserve currency or reserves of the US dollar, and they're now declining their US dollar reserves and starting to have other currencies, namely their local currencies in their reserves. So this reflects the changes in these pillars over time, especially now, sort of reflects US weakness in many ways. And on each continent, what we're seeing, and this is the sort of exciting stuff, amidst a ton of horror, are nations and groupings of peoples and entities that are clearly anti-imperialist. They are done with the US world order and they are done with the white world order. So in Africa, we have, for example, the alliance of Sahel states. That's I think, the most exciting example right now. On the other hand, you also have nations that are eager to be puppets or stooges of the empire. And so again, like in Africa, we have the example of Kenya, right? Which I don't need to discuss for this group. Same goes for Latin America, right? On the one hand, you have Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua, socialist states that are trying to take charge of their own resources. They are maintaining their own land. Their people support them. On the other hand, you have Chile, Boric in Chile, who people view as a social democrat or, I don't know, liberal, but he in fact is a complete SOUTHCOM stooge. El Salvador, Honduras, the list is quite long of the stooges. I do want to take a minute to mention Brazil as a specific problem, because I know a lot of the folks in this group talk about Brazil. Brazil is beyond Lula, right? Brazil is actually a broader problem than Lula, because Brazil views itself as the face of South America to the world. It opens the UN General Assembly. There's a variety of things that it does to maintain sort of this international position that it has had over time. Also, the reality is that when Bolsonaro was in power, he transformed the organs of the Brazilian government to uphold fascism, Brazilian fascism. And it was quite easy for him to do that. And so even if they replace people, the power is still situated in a specific kind of fascist way. And I think it's Brazil's historical relationship with racial slavery and anti-capital and anti-Blackness that has facilitated this process in Brazil. So Brazil is a specific problem that I've actually learned a lot about from Brazilian legal colleagues. I haven't read a lot about Brazil, but this is what I've heard from my colleagues in Brazil. Asia, and I think I only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to talk about Asia. The US is losing in Asia, and it knows that. It knows that. The ceasefire is a prime example of that. I can talk more about the ceasefire and the axis of resistance during Q&A. But the ceasefire is a massive US and Zionist defeat. And whatever happens, I mean, the bombs will continue, the horrors will continue. But the reality is that the alliance that Russia, China, and Iran have built, and the presence of the axis of resistance and the level of coordination, has basically made it impossible for the US to retain its foothold in Asia over the long term or even the short term. The Trump administration knows this. They know this. So they are looking west in what I call sort of a Trumpian Lebensraum. Lebensraum is the term that the Nazis used to expand in Europe when they were not so great at empire in Africa, and so they decided to take Europe. That's now what's happening with the United States. So this thing about Canada, about Greenland, about the Arctic Passage. If you look at a map of the globe, or if you look at a globe, right, like a little mini globe, you will see that once the ice melts in the north, the passage is like between all the continents through the north is tiny compared to the equatorial passages that we're now using, or the, through the Pacific and the Atlantic. So this thing about Greenland and Canada, not a joke. The minerals that are in Greenland that are untapped, all the minerals that are in that region, Trump is quite serious. And the Arctic Council as a whole has been discussing this for many years now. The canal that Nicaragua has been trying to build for many, many years to compete with the Panama Canal, another example. So there's basically a retaking of the Western Hemisphere now. And I think that's what we're going to see over the course of the next period. Am I done with time? I can't. Okay, so I was going to talk about fascism. I won't. Like, we can do that during Q&A. I do think that Trump is different than Biden, right? And that this is about fascism and its relationship to finance capital. And then we can talk about what is to be done during Q&A. But I do think the Caribbean needs to develop a confederation. And I'm happy to discuss that more later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina. Can folks hear me? Okay. For our next speaker, we have Gerald Pierrira, a theologian, educator, and activist. He has written on a wide range of topics, and his articles/essays can be found on international sites, including Modern Ghana, Internationalist 360, Block Agenda Report, Countercurrents, Just World, Hood Communist, Pambazuka, and Monthly Review. He is chairperson of the Organization for the Victory of the People, based in Guyana, and is an executive member of the Caribbean, Pan-African, and Indigenous Movement. He lived in the Libyan Jamahiriya for many years and was a founding member of the World Mathaba under the leadership of Muammar Gaddafi.
Thank you for having me. My video is off. Hello?
There you go. We can hear you. Now we can see you.
Okay. Okay, depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon. I would just like to thank and congratulate the organizers of this webinar. Let me begin by addressing the issue of SOUTHCOM and Operation Trade Winds in the Caribbean. The whole idea when SOUTHCOM and Operation Trade Winds came into existence, Operation Trade Winds came into existence in 1984, and it is held annually. I think it was only in 2022, during the COVID period, that 2022, there was no Operation Trade Winds, but every year it is held. And Operation Trade Winds came into existence the year after the assassination of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop and the overthrow of the Grenadian Revolution in 1983. All the Caribbean countries are members they participate in Operation Trade Winds. And the countries on the mainland of South America that are members, you have Brazil, Colombia, Peru, as well as, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And the whole thing about Operation Trade Winds and the US, which was created by the US Southern Command, is primarily to invade countries whose governments the United States empire is opposed to. That is primarily what it is all about, because it was established just after they invaded Grenada. And a number of CARICOM countries always participated. There was a period where some did not participate, like Guyana during the period of President Forbes Burnham, because when the problem started, when there was the issue between Bernard Cord and Maurice Bishop, Caribbean leaders were trying to settle the issue within their Caribbean community, CARICOM. And there was a meeting that was going on. This meeting was taking place in Trinidad in a conference hall. And Prime Minister Chambers, who was the Prime Minister then of Trinidad, and Prime Minister Burnham and Manley, they were trying to arrive at a Caribbean solution. But while they were in there participating in that meeting, some Caribbean leaders were outside having another meeting. And that meeting was made up of Eugenio Charles of the Commonwealth of Dominica, Edward Siaga, or we refer to him as Edward Siaga, and Tom Adams. And they decided to get the Americans to invade Grenada. And that is what happened. Some Caribbean countries objected to it and others went along with it. So today, every year, we have this exercise. And recently, I think last year it was held in Guyana. Last year it was held in Guyana. And now, recently, officials of U.S. South Command and those who carry out Operation Trade Winds met with the government of Trinidad and Tobago to sign some documents that would allow a U.S. presence in Trinidad. And anyone reading what is going on can see that having South Command base in Trinidad at this time, and with what is going on between Guyana and Venezuela, we can see that the whole thing is to encircle the Bolivarian Republic from Guyana's end, from Trinidad and Colombia. We know that there is a progressive government in Colombia, but tremendous pressure is being put on that government. And we've noticed already that they're trying to instigate some sort of constitutional coup or soft coup against that government. But we also have to understand that the whole thing about having the US South Command and this Operation Trade Winds is really to keep all countries in the US so-called sphere of interest, which is rooted in this Monroe Doctrine that we're in their backyard, that the US can intervene against any government that they're opposed to. And we know that when Teddy Roosevelt came into office, he extended the Monroe Doctrine with the so-called Roosevelt Corollary that says that the US can act as an international police. And that is what the US empire has been doing. Ever since the extension of the Monroe Doctrine in the form of the so-called Roosevelt Corollary, they invaded Santo Domingo in 1904, and then they went into Nicaragua in 1911, and then Haiti in 1915, and they've been in Haiti ever since. So what we're seeing now is that the US empire, wants to extend or is seeking to maintain its dominance. It's making things more difficult, and they're bringing tremendous pressure on CARICOM governments. One former president told me that one particular Caribbean government is very much afraid of the Americans. I mean, they actually bully the leaders of these countries. And I want to make this point that ever since the Monroe Doctrine, the United States has never taken any nation in its so-called backyard's independence seriously. They never did. They never really recognized the independence of any of these countries because it was their intention to draw all these countries into a grand United States and North American empire. And we can recall there was a US senator by the name of Albert J. Beveridge, he died in 1927. But somewhere in the 60s, I think it was 65, he was a Republican senator, and he addressed issues of race and order and power. And he said, these were his words, he said, "We, the Anglo-Saxon people, have the God-given right to civilize those who must be civilized." And he spoke about the countries in their so-called backyard as being uncivilized, and that the Anglo-Saxon people had the right to do so. And the entire Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary and everything is all based on race, maintaining order, dominance, and U.S. power. And today, this Operation Trade Wind, they've always said that the whole purpose of Operation Trade Wind that is held annually is just to make sure that Caribbean governments are ready, prepared for natural disasters, to fight the trafficking in small arms and trafficking in persons and so on. But that is just the front. The idea is to make sure that they have that permanent presence, that if there is any uprising or any progressive coup or anything to overthrow any reactionary government in the region, the US is there. It happened in I think it happened in the Black Power uprising in Trinidad in 1970, when there was a huge uprising, the Black Power uprising, to remove the government of Prime Minister Eric Williams. And the army carried out a mutiny and sided with the progressive forces. And the US intervened. The US naval forces in the region intervened with the Trinidadian Coast Guard and put down the attempted coup. Then you had the Jamaat al-Muslimin, a Muslim organization that attempted a coup in July of 1990. And the US was also involved in putting down that coup. So this thing about preparing us for natural disaster and fighting the trafficking in small arms, and so it's just a front. Caribbean police forces and military are capable of doing that, but this is always the excuse to have a permanent presence, a structure that will facilitate empires' intervention, direct intervention in the domestic affairs of these countries. And I think that is why the Venezuelan government is so nervous about, in relation to the territorial controversy that Venezuela has with Guyana, because Guyana is allowing itself to be a pawn. Guyana is allowing itself to be a pawn of the US empire. And no government, no country is going to government is going to sit by and allow itself to be encircled in order that when the time comes for that country to be invaded. And every country has a right to defend itself. I don't know how I'm doing on much I'm doing on time, but we can always come back to some of these issues and some of the things I've touched on during the question and answers. So I'll just check in with you, moderator, to see.
Let me see how many minutes you have left. Hold on. 3 minutes left, Gerald.
Okay. The other thing is that what is important, I would like to point out here, is in this something that has always been left out when we look at the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary and what Beveridge said, is that the empire has always used a theology that we refer to as North Atlantic theology to justify what the empire is doing. And all of the churches or denominations that constitute the Christian faith for years have went along with providing some sort of theological and religious justification to buttress, to support what the empire is doing. But you've always had periods in the history of the empire where people resisted that position. I mean, in the United States, you had Nat Turner and others. But in contemporary period, the only resistance or counter-narrative to the bogus theology or the theology of the empire, North Atlantic theology, came from the liberation theology that emerged in Latin America and the Black liberation theology tradition that emerged in the United States with radical theologians like Albert Cleage, James Cone, and a number of others who have challenged that right-wing, reactionary North Atlantic theology that has been the foundation of the empire. And that is where the roots of this right-wing evangelical tradition came out of. And it is there, and you can see why today you have a lot of the right-wing evangelicals supporting their Trump regime. And I think one of the biggest mistakes the left has made over the decades, over the years, except during the period of the social gospel of the Neighbor Brothers and so on, is the, and when I say the left, I'm talking about the organized left. I'm not speaking about the individuals and so that, you know, or the Cornel West. Cornel West has made a great contribution to that tradition. But the left need to counter the right-wing evangelical by using their very scripture to take them on. Because when you read the Christian scriptures, and you really get into to understand the theology of liberation, the right-wing evangelicals have no ground to stand on. They have no ground to stand on because that tradition is very radical, it's very revolutionary. And the left need to put this, we need at times to put this whole thing about, because we are going to people who are very spiritual, the masses of people who believe in something that is transcendental, but we need not to see that ground to the right-wing evangelicals who are supporters. I'm talking about the movements of Sunday churches who are nothing but, I don't like the term, but we can describe them as Christo-fascism. And this is the movement that is pushing, that is behind Trump. And we have not been able to counter that by using the very scriptures that they like to quote to counter them. And I think this has been one of the weaknesses of the left and the progressive forces over the years, of not taking them on by countering the reactionary positions with the theology of liberation, the revolutionary message of Christ that was hijacked by the imperialists, hijacked by the churches that colluded with imperialism to maintain the existing order. And we know that that goes back for centuries. For centuries, when the church used their position to justify the enslavement, the capture and enslavement of Africans and colonial genocide and genocide against the indigenous peoples. So what we're seeing today, the whole thing about this SOUTHCOM and the US trade winds, we can go, this is not something that just evolved, that just came out recently. It has its roots in the genesis of the empire. And we cannot separate the politics of the empire from the religion of the empire. This false religion that justifies what the empire is doing, and in the words of Beveridge, to civilize the uncivilized in the US so-called backyard. I will stop there.
Thank you, Gerald. I wanted to introduce our next speaker, Alejandro Rusconi, a member of Movimiento Evita in Argentina, Secretary of International Relations for the Partido La Patria de los Comunes, Distrito Buenos Aires, member of the AAJ, Asociación Americana de Juristas, Rama Argentina, or the American Association of Jurists, Argentina branch, and Secretary of Habitat, Land, and Housing of the Ombudsman of the Province of Buenos Aires. Compañero Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Clau, and thank you everyone who is participating. You are all colleagues and compañeros organizing this collective, our common collective, as CELAC declared it in Cuba in 2014, which is Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. I am going to try to speak at a moderate pace, which is not typical of me, in order to make the job of the interpreters a little bit more feasible. I am going to refer to a case which in English is known as SOUTHCOM. This refers to systematic persecution of leaders and politicians. I'm going to talk about lawfare, and this has been widely used in Latin America when and also when there's harassment of popular groups. This use of the word lawfare is not gratuitous. Rather, it refers to a phenomenon that transcends judicial brutality. It is a coordinated effort amongst the major media, that is to say, the corporate media, opinion makers, and right-wing leaders, along with intelligence services, generally coordinated by the United States Embassy. All of this is to prepare and create an environment so that members of the judiciary can attack leaders of popular governments and progressive forces, either through preventive detention or through illegal or abusive use of special delegations, which has been used in Argentina, or through armed force. This war has not only impacted government officials and members of progressive parties, but rather it also affects the executive branch as well as the legislative branch. They have all been manipulated, and this has changed the balance of power in these systems. So there is tremendous concern about this. We have the Puebla group looking at it, various political thinkers. And they've been looking at how they've used lawfare. As an Argentinian, I have an obligation to look at this. I must tell you what has happened here in my country, in Argentina, particularly with our former president, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who was then served as vice president, and what happened to the former minister of planning, Julio Rebillo, as well as with other grassroots leaders such as Monserrat Esteche, who were victims of lawfare. But Cristina is a tremendous example of this because there are more than 600 cases against her. As Dr. Zaffaroni, a former member of the Supreme Court of Justice of Argentina, and also a member of the American Association of Jurists, lawfare has been waged in the recent times with technology, in which they put together thousands of pages of legal suits, but they couldn't do that before. But now they can do what these judges do, is to just cut and paste and activate things. You have to read all of the case files very carefully in order to see where the crime lies that she's being accused of, because everything else is just a matter of cut and paste. So this is something that has a very serious impact in Argentina, because it has come to be known, and what it applies is the doctrine of residual power. So we have Dr. Martin Newson and another judge who, based on this doctrine, they believe that those who exercise power or had a government post continue to have residual power that can benefit them if they are at liberty. So for that reason, what they do is they impose preventive detention. And this is terrible in terms of any defendant's rights in a trial. They also have the theory of a delay. This is where you can, because anybody's case is going to be accelerated. This is terrible because of this individual who might be accusing someone, and the same person in the state of Argentina gave them money to build a hotel in the province of Mendoza. And so when we analyze this, we have to look at all of the trials and see whether they're different in every country. But behind all of this, we have the empire, we have the US Embassy, and we also have the major communications groups, and these are multinationals. We have to look at what has been behind all of the various coups d'etats over the last century. For example, we have the attempted coup against Chavez in 2002, and the attempted coup, or the first attempted coup against Evo Morales in 2008. If you remember, in Bolivia, part of the country known as the Half Moon, including Santa Cruz de la Sierra, these provinces wanted to break away from Bolivia. We also had the attempted coup d'etat in Ecuador against Rafael Correa in 2010 on September 30th, 2010. And we should also bear in mind these various actions, because we can say, well, how can we stop this lawfare? What should we do about this? What we need to do and look at the processes of integration that we have. We need to strengthen them. We should remember that when the police sequestered Correa during the attempted coup d'etat in his country, well, in Argentina, they called a meeting of UNASUR. At that time, Nestor Kirchner was the Secretary General of UNASUR, and he brought together all of the UNASUR countries, and they unleashed a major mass mobilization, and they gathered around the embassy of Ecuador, and they marched during the night to the foreign ministry, where all of the foreign ministers and presidents of the UNASUR countries were gathered. And this is how, what did the popular governments did? They closed the path for Ecuador. In other words, they said that they were going to protect Ecuador. And this is because in 2010, we had lots of progressive governments, and they represented their people, Argentina, Uruguay, Venezuela, and Bolivia, amongst other popular governments. And you may also recall that also the coup d'etat against Zelaya. That was because he was going to join ALBA, the integration, the most genuine and solidarity-based integration project in the Americas. And there we had the coup against Dilma Rousseff, and also the attempt against Lula, in which they used media and legal mechanisms to try to delegitimize political adversaries and block them from returning to power. And here, once again, we should bear in mind the complicity of the media and the courts and individuals, which we may recall, like a Judge Moro in Brazil, who put together a narrative that blamed Lula for corruption in Brazil. And Sergio Moro later became a minister in Bolsonaro's government. But what happened after that? All of his cases were overturned because they discovered chats between Judge Moro and the prosecutors, which is incredible and unethical. And later, Judge Moro became a senator and a minister under Bolsonaro. But whenever he's out of office, we believe that he might be imprisoned. But then there is another case that we cannot leave out, which is that of Pedro Castillo in Peru. All of these are cases of lawfare, just as they did against Lula and against Pedro Castillo. Pedro Castillo, we should recall who he is. He is a teacher who represented the grassroots working class sectors of Peru, and he won the presidential election in the second round. And he was against the Congress because during the first round, the person who had, one was Fujimori. And what Pedro Castillo promoted was that mineral resources be used for the people. In other words, that the mining concessions be reviewed and to tax these projects in order for the poorest regions of the country could benefit from this taxing on this mining activity. And just to close, I know I don't have much time left. I would also like to mention Daniel Hadwe, who was also a victim of Lawfare, and he was the mayor of Recoleta, which is a city in Santiago de Chile. And we should recall that he was reelected with a very large percentage of the votes. But who attacked Daniel Hadwe for his politics? The major pharmaceutical companies, because they were against the People's Forces, and because Daniel Hadwe was looking at the real estate and trying to make housing available to low-income people. So all of the sectors that have been attacked by Lawfare have been attacked because they have tried to establish policies for the redistribution of wealth and improve the quality of life of people who voted them into office. We can also not forget about the persecution in El Salvador against Lorena Peña, who is a comrade and president of the Democratic Association of Women, and also the chief of the parliament, who was the president of the assembly, and many other comrades who have suffered. Paula Pavon is the prefect of Quito in Ecuador. At a certain point in time, she was handcuffed, and she was stopped that way. So what we have to do is, as I said at the beginning, we have to declare Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. We need to strengthen all of our cooperation agencies and our integration, as well as our social programs. We need to strengthen CELAC Social as well. This is an organization that I was involved in Argentina under CELAC, and also in Honduras. And the next meeting is going to be held in Colombia. So this is an organization that brings together people's grassroots organizations, and we representatives of workers, Afro-descendants, and original peoples and social movements, in order to establish a parallel agenda and have a space for dialogue with the CELAC governments. So I'm going to stop here because time is running out, and I'm look forward to participating in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Gracias, hermano. Last, but certainly not least, our last speaker is Erica Keynes, the Field Operations and Membership Coordinator of the Black Alliance for Peace, and a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Haiti Americas team and the Black Working Class Centered JIMA People's Progress Party in Maryland. Keynes is also the founder of Liberation Through Reading and co-editor of the revolutionary African blog Hood Communist, and an esteemed comrade.
All right. Thank you, Clau. And I just want to say thank you to the speakers before me. I hope everyone can hear. My mic is good. Because that was incredible context, I think, to what I'm going to be able to provide. I'm going to be speaking more concretely about, and I think we've heard the term from the other speakers, about soft power. And so I just want to preface that with saying, when we were yet but a small but mighty committee, before we were emancipated into a team, the Haiti Americas team at the time in 2021, we were conducting counteractions in LA against the Summit of the Americas. And our esteemed co-coordinator, Jamila Pierre, made a comment that has since stuck with me all these years after, because I think it really helped me engage the way, or excuse me, it helped me shape the way I engage the question of soft power. And I'm paraphrasing, but Jamila said that people need to understand that nonprofits and NGOs are one and the same. And I don't think a statement could have been truer, especially in the ways that the Black Alliance for Peace emphasizes domestic and global imperialism as counterparts. Because in spite of a growing recognition to understand the ways that the nonprofit industrial complex, the NPIC, serves to continue our repression domestically, non-governmental organizations, which are NGOs, are still not recognized for what they are, which is quickly and overtly becoming a detriment to the colonized world moreover. The MPIC and NGOs are just another example, like I said, of that domestic and global connection of imperialism. But when we talk about nonprofits and the way that they undermine movement, it is with the recognition of the ways that nonprofits adapt, co-opt, and deter movements, all while projecting assistance and help, essentially, in many instances, taking on the role of the state. But I do feel it necessary to note that, like nonprofits, NGOs are not inherently a bad thing. However, we should understand how the state is using NGOs and what that has meant for the Americas. So NGOs often present themselves as neutral actors working to address humanitarian needs, but closer examinations and understanding is needed, because it reveals the significance in their role in advancing an imperialist agenda, which is under the guise of philanthropy often. NGOs are funded, well, many NGOs rather, are funded by governments, corporate foundations, and international institutions that serve geopolitical interests. And it makes them tools for soft power and regime change. So by operating outside of state structures and leveraging language of civil society, NGOs frequently undermine the sovereignty of nations, particularly in the global South. And they have played a crucial role, an essential role in fomenting color revolutions, where they exploit genuine grievances to destabilize governments' resistance to Western interests. In addition to political interference, NGOs also perpetuate a neocolonial dynamic. They position themselves as saviors while framing African, Asian, and Latin American nations as incapable of self-determination. So this narrative reinforces a global hierarchy where Western powers get to dictate development models, eroding local capacities and economies. And then moreover, NGOs mask the structural violence of capitalism and imperialism, because they only address the symptoms of poverty, hunger, and healthcare disparity, but they do not actually challenge or address the root causes. So they maintain the status quo, which you can see also the nonprofit industrial complex. But NGOs function as extensions of empire, and they advance the same sort of exploitative systems that they claim to oppose. So this makes them part of the problem rather than the solution. So more concretely, I do want to speak to some bipartisan policies that both push and encourage the growth of NGOs in the Americas to intentionally undermine sovereignty and self-determination. But in order to do so, I do need to highlight a few of these institutions that make that possible. So I'm sure folks are familiar with NED, or the National Endowment for Democracy, and also USAID. And these are the more, I guess, prominent known tools of soft power, although folks do not recognize them as such. But they instigate internal opposition against left-wing governments and potential color revolutions, as I noted, NED specifically. NED is a nonprofit foundation dedicated to the growth and strengthening of quote-unquote democratic institutions around the world. And it began as the Reagan administration solution to the storm of negative publicity following the Church Committee. So it was established in 1983. But NED's initial use was when it was established, was undermining Eastern European governments in the name of that, quote, democracy and freedom of speech, end quote. But once the Soviet Union fell, NED's purpose shifted to projecting U.S. government interests everywhere. So agencies like National Endowment or Open Society, these are the type of NGOs that provide resources, training, and platforms to opposition movements, which are then steered towards neoliberal or pro-Western outcomes. These efforts create dependency on external actors and strip local movements of their autonomy. And you may have heard some examples of NED's work, which include the 2014 Maidan protests in Ukraine and the 2019 Hong Kong protests and the 2021 Cuban protests. NED's outside. But there's also organizations such as the OCCRP, which exemplify the sort of duality of NGOs. Because while that institution exposes corruption, they rely so heavily on US funding. So we're familiar with this institution because they've led major investigations like the Panama and Pandora Papers. But they're also making they also receive a budget well over $20 million from the USAID and the Department of State. So not only is the US government largely untargeted by this institution's reporting, it also manages to orientate the NGO's coverage by providing the funds, right? So, which the OCCRP has the obligation to use on reports that focus on the sort of designated countries. And this includes Russia, this includes Venezuela, so these are just governed by autocrats who Washington regards as just enemies. And Mike Henning, who's a senior advisor of the USAID, the Europe and Eurasians office, he said that I'm very proud to say that I think OCCRP is one of the best achievements that the USAID has made in the field of democracy and governance. And this is important because they use this institution as ways as for investigative journalism. But what it has done has sort of just sideswiped, I think, a lot of the ways that we're able to obtain information and how we are receiving the information. So the fixation on the cartels in Latin America and etc., that they are investigating or leading major investigations on does prop up or propel or validate the US's targeting and putting a bounty on Maduro's head, targeting Honduras for the same reasons. So I think it's also important to note that something else that Alan Weinstein, who's the founder of NED, has said, that a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. It is important, like I noted, both the National Endowment of Democracy and the OCCRP, they are funded by the USAID, which is a private international development agency that is under the Department of Defense. It is under the State Department. So the USAID is used to advance US's national security and economic prosperity, providing leadership training for its preferred political candidates worldwide. But then also, while it claims to be a human rights organization, its funds are allocated back to oppositions and insurrections. So that is some of the institutions that are tools for soft power that the U.S. is able to use. And how they're able to use them, I'm going to speak to just two policies recently that I think it's really important to highlight, because I do think it does highlight a bit of what we're seeing kind of develop in these last couple of years, and what we may be seeing coming. So in December 2019, President Trump signed into law the HR 2116, which is the Global Fragilities Act of 2019. It was introduced by a Democratic representative, Eliot Engel. He was the then chair of the House's Committees on Foreign Affairs, and it was co-sponsored by a bipartisan group of representatives, including significantly CBC leading member Karen Bass. And we all love Karen recently, right? But the Global Fragility Act presents a new set of strategies for deploying U.S. soft power in a changing world. So this act focuses on U.S. foreign power on the idea that there are fragile states and whose fragility could be undermined, or whose fragility could in fact undermine U.S. security interests. And they define fragile states as those where state weakness or failure would magnify threats to the American homeland. And one of those places they identified, which is a testing ground for this particular act and policy, is Haiti. So the GFA outlines a peace-building strategy to stabilize conflict areas and prevent violence and fragility. It emphasizes building relationships with local civil society by strengthening the capacity of the United States to be an effective leader of international efforts to prevent extremism and violent conflict. And then the act is just sort of resetting the U.S. foreign policy in ways that shift tactics. The Haiti Americas team has a fact sheet on the Global Fragilities Act. We've spoken about it tremendously in these last couple of years. But I do think with the advancement of the Alliance of Sahelian States in West Africa and noting that the Global Fragilities Act names West African nations, it is we're seeing that this is a very important and significant policy that we should be paying attention to, because one of the stated objectives is for the U.S. government to be proactive in preventing conflict and instability, instead of assuming a reactive role. And how they're doing that, or how they plan on doing that, is by being funded or managed rather by the United States Agency for International Development, which is the USAID, and its parent, the U.S. State Department. So this is important. They're going to be using the National Endowment for Democracy as an integral part of the Biden administration's strategy, or it was an integral part of the Biden administration's strategy for global democratic renewal to maintain the United States. So,
Slow down a little.
thank you.
Interpretation.
So two things that I just think we should consider as I'm talking about the Global Fragilities Act, and what does it mean that it starts in Haiti? Because what does it mean that this, for an occupied country with the largest amount of registered NGOs in the region, from 3 to 10,000, I believe, and over 400 of those are working directly with the USAID, that this is the testing ground for this policy? And what are we going to see happen out in the years to come? And the second policy that I want to highlight, which has been severely under discussed, and it's not really a new policy. It gets similar to Operation Trade Winds. It kind of goes, it's a yearly thing that they revisit the policy and update the policy as needs be. And that's the America Competes Act of 2022. And on February 4th in 2022, the House passed the reauthorization of the America Competes Act, and it was followed by the Senate, who passed it in March. So the premise of the reauthorization, or the latest reauthorization of the American Competes Act, is that China is a dangerous economic rival that presents a national security threat. And it's also a malign influence. And folks may remember those words specifically regarding Russia and its relationship to African countries, because the U.S. was threatening to sanction African nations that had relationships or dealt with Russia. But as the global South increasingly moves toward these sort of multipolar alliances to combat Western domination, the America Competes Act represents this desperate attempt to regain control over Latin America and the Caribbean via USAID initiatives that use the war on drugs to position other nations as a dangerous imposition, or even China and Russia as dangerous impositions to the landscape of Latin America and the Caribbean. And in that policy, I do want to highlight two particular sections. in the America Competes Act, Section 30113, it notes that supporting economic independence from the People's Republic of China. That's what the the section is titled. It states that the president should develop and submit a strategy utilizing federal agencies to resource and to counteract Chinese assistance and financing to foreign governments. And this authorizes the Secretary of State in coordination with the USAID administrator to establish a new initiative or continue an existing one as the infrastructure transaction and assistance network to advance the development of sustainable, transparent, and high quality infrastructure. The other one is the section 30251, and it is countering China's educational and cultural diplomacy in Latin America. And this is directing, it states, to direct the Secretary of State, acting through the Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs, and in coordination with the Assistant Administrator of Bureau of Economic Growth, Education and Environment at USAID, to devise a strategy that evaluates and expands existing people-to-people programs, and creates new exchanges and people-to-people programs that advance U.S. foreign policy goals. And then
Thank
also
you.
finally in section 30252, the narcotics trafficking in Latin America and the Caribbean. So they simply are just stating that they plan on using the USAID and NGOs to sort of circumvent that. So both of these, we're seeing these policies or these acts prioritize securing U.S. corporate interests, consolidating neoliberal frameworks, and suppressing the alternative developmental paths, i.e. the attacks on China and Russia, using the Americas as proxy at the expense of national sovereignty. I can end there for the sake of time because I'm sure people may have some questions directly about all of this, but I hope that you got just a gist of, of what NGOs are and how they've been used as soft power tools in addition to sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. These are all really great interventions. We have a few questions here, and this is for anyone, but I'm really interested also in this question myself. Coming from Haki Mohammed, and if anyone has any questions, there's a Q&A button on the bottom. You can type in your questions there for any of the speakers on any of the topics discussed or anything else related. So from Haki Mohammed, will Cuban membership within BRICS allow the Cuban government to work around the illegal embargo? And in regards to something Professor Nina had mentioned before, which is this like retaking of what the Western Hemisphere. I'm curious what any and all of the speakers think about the role of BRICS in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the Chancay port in Peru that just recently opened up during APEC, and what that means for this retaking of the Western Hemisphere. So maybe I'll start with Nina and then anyone else can jump in.
So I think over the last 6 months or so, we've seen some Chinese presence in this hemisphere, specifically in Central and South America, as you just mentioned. And so part of the Lebensraum, right, or the retaking of the hemisphere that I talked about is also driven by that, right? It's a reaction to the presence of the Chinese and sort of going back to the Monroe Doctrine as a fallback mechanism. In terms of Cuba, yes, definitely. Joining BRICS will help Cuba. One of the major advantages of joining BRICS is that they've created a bunch of financial mechanisms and banking mechanisms that uphold the economies of its members, especially the sanctioned economy. So they help the sanctioned economies a lot. And I think I see BRICS as a very promising development. I On the other hand, I was deeply disturbed by the exclusion of Venezuela, and I'm very concerned about what that means. I'm not I'm sure that Brazil, I spoke about Brazil. I'm sure that Brazil did indeed have a role to play in that. They vetoed it, but I'm also concerned about why that actually happened, right? And so I think Venezuela has a lot stored in terms of making sure that it does enter BRICS. I think other nations in the 10 are very interested in making sure that Venezuela enters. But I do think that was a bit of a, I hope it's not a miner's canary, right? But we'll see. I also want to make a correction. I mentioned Honduras in my talk. Somebody raised it in the Q&A. I was actually talking about Honduras historically, not Honduras in the current moment. But I will say that Honduras does host American bases, right? So Honduras is one of these nations that's kind of an in-between. They're trying to release themselves from the American orbit. On the other hand, they haven't entirely. So I just wanted to clarify that. I know you mentioned Peru. I think others are better situated to talk about that than me. Thank you.
Thank you. Alejandro, I think you had your hand raised if you wanted to speak to this.
Sí, gracias. No, por el tema de los BRICS, quiero, y el ingreso de Venezuela, quiero informar que la semana pasada se reunió el grupo de trabajo del Foro de Sao Paulo en Venezuela, paralelamente al Festival Internacional Antifascista, y se aprobó una resolución por la cual va a haber este año una reunión en Brasil entre los partidos políticos del BRICS y los partidos políticos del Foro de Sao Paulo. Esta propuesta la hizo el representante de Cuba a los fines de que ingrese Venezuela a los BRICS, es decir, movilizar a los partidos de nuestra América que integran el Foro de Sao Paulo y a los partidos políticos de los BRICS para que se reúnan en Brasil a los efectos de discutir la integración de Venezuela a los BRICS. Era para esta información. Gracias.
Thank you. Erica, did you have any comments on this? Gerald, I want to exclude our other speaker.
Yes. I would like to say that the presence of the People's Republic of China in the Caribbean region has done a lot for the various countries that have diplomatic relations with China. For example, Guyana is probably the first country in the English-speaking Caribbean that established relations with China, going right back to the days under Chairman Mao Zedong. That was since in the 70s. And we've maintained that relationship. But over the years, I know that there's tremendous pressure. Pressure is being applied on some governments to ease their relations with China or open up their economies, their countries to Western multinational corporations, and to somehow sideline the People's Republic of China. That pressure is being exerted on some countries, but there's some countries who, in the Caribbean, of course, are committed to maintaining that relations. Guyana has benefited tremendously from what the Chinese have done. And the relationship, the relations between China and the Caribbean countries, what they've done for Barbados, for example, and in Nicaragua and in Jamaica, the Chinese policy is this: the Chinese do not interfere in your national affairs, and they respect you, they treat you as an equal, irrespective of your size, wealth, or power. That is how they deal with you. Unlike the Western countries, United States, the European Union, in Guyana, they talk to you as though we are still enslaved. That is how they relate to us. It's one where they dictate. For example, we have in Guyana, we have the European Union ambassador who openly interferes in our domestic affairs. The Western diplomats do. When you listen to some of the Western diplomats in Guyana, you want to know if Guyana is a republic and if we're independent and sovereign. And since I'm on this topic, I would like to say this, because it was mentioned earlier about, I think the first speaker said that if you're pursuing socialist policies and so how the empire will deal with you. Well, I do agree. But as I said earlier, the United States, the empire, never recognized, when you look at the way they relate to the countries in their so-called backyard, they never recognized the independence of these countries, right? To see a substantial independence. So what we have is they recognize we have a sort of flag and anthem independence, or what Walter Rodney once called in the briefcase independence. So if you look at Cuba, even if Cuba was not socialist, but you pursue a policy and you struggle to achieve substantial independence, real independence, you will earn the wrath of the empire, because the empire does not believe that any country in its backyard should have substantial independence. No. And hence that's why we have to deal with what we call neocolonialism, because in order to achieve true independence, we'll have to dismantle, we'll have to fight neocolonialism. And that's why in the Caribbean, we have all these, we have Republican status and all of that. But when you look at the existing arrangement, both at the political and economic level, you will see that our presidents and prime ministers they're in office, but they do not have power. And office and power are two different things, because the empire is dictating to them in one way or the other. Some of them go along to a certain extent and then they pull back. And we're seeing it in terms of Trinidad, where Trinidad is allowing the Americans to reactivate a base that they had there many years ago, and to have a U.S. presence there. The other thing I left out is, when I was dealing with SOUTHCOM and Operation Trade Winds, is that both the United Kingdom, France, and Holland, the Netherlands, are members of SOUTHCOM and Operation Trade Winds. They participate in it because France and the United Kingdom and Netherlands, they have colonies in the Caribbean. So they participate. The French also participate in the French, the Dutch, as well as the British. They participate in the SOUTHCOM operations.
I just want to jump in here for a moment. So it's true what Gerald says about sovereignty, but that's not specific to the empire's relationship with the Caribbean or its own quote unquote backyard. It's the same in the region from which I come, which is the Middle East or West Asia. Most of the nations in that region do not have sovereignty unless they have left the orbit of the Americans formally. That's basically Iran, right? And now Yemen, and so this is not specific to the American backyard. It looks different, right? How the U.S. empire operates in our region looks very different than how it operates here or in the Southern Hemisphere. But this is endemic to U.S. imperialism overall.
Well, I did say that when Roosevelt extended the Monroe Doctrine in the so-called Roosevelt Corollary, he said that the U.S. has the right to intervene anywhere as an international policeman. That is what Theodore Roosevelt said. And the Americans went beyond their so-called backyard into other areas. And we know that they've always removed progressive regimes. The U.S., we know what the U.S. did in after Bandung, the Bandung conference, what they did to Ahmed Sukarno, the overthrow of Sukarno and the installing of the Suharto regime. More than 1 million communists were slaughtered in Indonesia. And we know their role in the Middle East and other areas where they intervened in support of putting pressure on President Nasser, what they did in the Congo, as well as the role they played in the removal of Ghana's first president Nkrumah. Yeah, we're aware of this. That is not that their activities and interests is not just limited to the so-called backyard, but it's global.
Thank you, Gerald, and thank you both for such thoughtful answers. We only have time for one more question, and then we have a final video. Just 2 minutes on the last answer, or on the last question, I mean. So actually, let me just take it from the question here. What are some thoughts and ideas you have about the role of Africans in America, seeing ourselves as Africans in the West, beyond the imperialistic definitions which isolate us from building regional solidarity across the Western Hemisphere? And I would want to actually start out with Erica.
Okay, well, I just got to read that question again because I'm trying to figure out what the ask is in terms of relating it back to the Americas. Well, so I could just preface this with I'm Pan-African, so it's not so much that I see myself as an African in the West. I am an African in the West, and that is my understanding. And it also helps me with frameworks like internal colonialism and understanding what my role and part is and my positionality here is in the U.S. And then that through that framework helps me connect on the level or basis of internationalism, understanding the sort of connections between other colonized peoples, right? For instance, even talking about the Global Fragilities Act, I could have easily mentioned that the Safer Americas Act under Biden mirrors, at least language-wise, the exact same thing, searching for these sort of fragile neighborhoods to occupy, to control. And without understanding myself as an African or part of the colonized world, I would not be able to make those connections to then be able to express, this is why we should care about Haiti, this is why we should care about Peru, this is why we should care about Puerto Rico, and not because we're Black Americans, but because this is our Americas. Not simply because I'm an African in the Americas, but because this is a part of all of us, right? And the way that we talked about SOUTHCOM earlier, one of the things that we do in terms of the Zone of Peace campaign and us trying to uphold that campaign domestically and get people to buy into that campaign domestically by seeing themselves as part and parcel of the Americas, we compare SOUTHCOM to Cop City. We talk about the School of the Americas being similar to that, or Guantanamo Bay, just by the layout of what Cop City is. So that's my 2 minutes.
A little slower for the interpreter.
Yeah. But yeah, but I guess to conclude in my 2 minutes is I think that's the importance of understanding who we are clearly as Africans, because it does open the door up to have that international perspective, that things are not just solely about what's going on in the US.
Thank you. And to the other panelists, similar question, right? How then can we use both internal and external colonialism and imperialism as a framework to move towards regional integration through solidarity and defending sovereignty from where you're situated? So maybe we can start with Alejandro.
Yes. I think that we need to act as activists in an integrated way. We need to defend, we talk about Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace, but we also want to have world peace. And we want to see an end to the war between Ukraine and Russia. We want to put an end to the genocide occurring in Palestine. While a ceasefire has been signed, that doesn't mean it's ended. Our battle is that of the whole world, and we need to integrate. As we talk about multipolarity, all of us have different origins. If you look at my last names, you see an Italian in there, and also Pereira, which is from Portugal, which also means I have some Black in me. So we need to be aware of who we are, and we have to know where we are headed and what we want. What we want is peace in the world. Thank you.
Gracias, Alejandro. Nina?
So I actually was going to end there. In my talk, but I didn't have time. I think we should take some cues from the victory that we just saw in Palestine, right? That is a victory of the national liberation struggle waged primarily by the Palestinian peoples and secondarily by the rest of the axis of resistance. The Haitian Revolution was a national liberation struggle that won. The Iranian Revolution was a national liberation struggle that won. The Nicaraguan Revolution was a national liberation struggle that won. And they used every tool at their disposal. They used armed struggle. They used international solidarity movements. They even used international law with all of its flaws. And they organized themselves. The axis of resistance did not emerge out of the blue. It took decades to create this formation, this coalition of entities that organize themselves to fight and win. And I think that other groupings around the world, right, regional groupings need to follow that model. The axis of resistance was following the Bolivarian model and the victories of the Haitian Revolution. And so it's time to sort of think in that way, how to defend ourselves, how to feed ourselves, and how to win. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And the same question to you, Gerald.
Just a few things I'd like to touch on. One, of course, the Haitian Revolution was the first internationalist revolution because the Haitian revolutionaries made it clear that anyone resisting enslavement, wherever you were and you fled to Haiti and you landed there, you were free. And they even extended their support material and support in the form of providing printing press, weaponry, finance, and everything to liberation, other struggles, including Bolivar's struggle in what is known today as Venezuela and Colombia. That was an internationalist revolution long before we were talking about the proletarian internationalism of the Bolshevik Revolution. The French Revolution, even itself, was never internationalist as such. It did not extend that. Of course, I know the ideas of liberty, fraternity, and so on went beyond its borders, but when it came to really implementing it in Haiti, that was something different. The other thing is, I believe that the progressive forces and the revolutionary forces in the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas and the United States and Canada and so on, we have to forge closer relationship. I think we have to work together. Sometimes we in the Caribbean just operate as though, we're just the Caribbean alone and we don't pay too much. We talk about Nicaragua, we talk about Cuba, we're involved in work with them and so on, but we have to work with others like the Black Alliance for Peace and the United People's Party for Progress, the AAPRP and those groups. We have to bring you in. We all have to work at the regional level because we want the Caribbean to be a zone of peace. The other thing is I believe in the way forward in the struggle against the empires. We have to build a multi-ideological movement. And when I say multi-ideological, I'm saying that I'm not talking about bringing in pro-capitalist organizations and so anti. No, that's not what I mean. Whether you're inspired by the revolutionary teachings of Islam, whether you're inspired by liberation theology, whether you're a Marxist or communist, we all have to work together to bring an end to the empire. I will give an example because my sister mentioned the axis of resistance, and that attack that was led by Hamas when they rightfully went into the occupied, into Zionist territory. The Western media keeps speaking about Hamas and Hamas and Hamas, but Hamas was only one organization that participated. There were 6 organizations that launched that attack. 6, including Islamic Jihad, and there were 2 Marxist-Leninist organizations involved in that. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine that was founded by the late Dr. George Habash, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by Naif Awatmid. 2 Marxist-Leninist organizations participated in that. They provided fighters. Between those 2 organizations, I think they had about 800 fighters that day. But we keep hearing about Hamas, and that's deliberate, because those who are doing that have an agenda is to show that Hamas, to position Hamas as some Islamic extremist and terrorist organization that launched this attack on Israel. So it is put over as a struggle between an Islamic organization and a Jewish organization. So the struggle is about between Judaism or Jewish, the Jews, and between Muslims, and that is not so. So we have to build a multi-ideological that will involve those forces that I identified before. And years ago, I must mention this in the Libyan Jamahiriya, this is what was done. Gaddafi had established the World Mataba, and it brought together liberation forces and freedom fighters from all over the world. And they were given military training there. You had from the ANC, the PAC, and the only criteria for membership was that you had to be anti-fascist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and anti-Zionist to join. So if you were from an indigenous movement, you were welcome to be a member. Even the Gypsies, the Front for the Liberation of Romania, they were members. So that is what I'm talking about. Bringing together, as the sister said, the progressive forces from Iran, from Nicaragua, from Cuba, from the Bolivarian Republic, the China supporting.
Appreciate you. I want to say thank you to everyone who's stayed on. Thank you to all our speakers, our interpreters, everyone who's joined. Please stay for the closing video that we have. And this has been a wonderful conversation. And yeah, let's get to work.
In terms of April 4th, in 1949, 28 European countries and 2 North American countries formed the Intergovernmental Military Alliance known as NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But a lot of the reasons why we wanted to have this is primarily also talk about the U.S., even though it may seem that the U.S. is always centered. And we talk about our Americas or the rest of America is a disconnect from understanding ourselves as part and parcel of the Americas. And when we talk about the militarization, we can see the ways that we connect through that. That the U.S. Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM, is one of these combatant commands, incorporating the Caribbean, South and Central America. SOUTHCOM claims to be protecting human rights in the region as a long-term responsibility through the development of regional militaries, controlled and facilitated by the U.S.
1,500 experts from the participating nations, militaries, and medical personnel will work together to share tactics, techniques, and procedures to ensure seamless integration during future emergencies or times of crisis. This is straight from the SOUTHCOM website, by the way. The exercise focuses on a wide array of operational objectives, including disaster response, medical readiness, cyber defense, search and recovery, water rescue, and small arms combat tactics.
This July 25th will mark 127 years since the U.S. invaded and occupied our lands. As a result of us being a colony, Puerto Rico doesn't have a say in being able to participate in activities that SOUTHCOM or anything else that the U.S. military wants to do. They use this land in Vieques still to this day, and also Roosevelt Roads, which is located in Ceiba on the main island, to do further military testing.
The U.S. has also been pressing countries in the region, which have Russian and Soviet-era military equipment, to donate them to Ukraine in the U.S. NATO proxy war against Russia. It can now count on a significant stockpile of arms, including 24 Mi-17 military helicopters and 2 Mi-35 attack helicopters from Moscow, and arms bought during the Fujimori regime. As General Laura Richardson has stated in January of this year, last year during a virtual appearance at Atlantic Council, they are working with the countries that have the Russian equipment to either donate it or switch it out for United States equipment, with 6 countries in particular, Peru, being among the leaders in possession of Russian military equipment. U.S. Air Force F-16 Viper demonstration team performed combat capabilities demonstrations between the U.S. and Peru at the Festival Aéreo Chiclayo 2024 in Chiclayo, Peru, June 15th and 16th. Here also you can see 2 B-52 bombers flying mission in support of SOUTHCOM. As part of the Air Force Global Strike Command, the B-52 enables combat-ready forces to conduct strategic nuclear deterrence and global strike operations in support of combatant commanders. Since the coup on December 7, 2022 continues to rise, with at least 100 deaths. Increased cooperation and training, interoperability, enhanced coordination, and further deepening of these ties has meant effectively that the Peruvian armed forces are largely under the influence of the U.S. military. But with this repression comes resistance. The Peruvian masses have not stopped organizing and mobilizing against Congress for justice for the over 100 martyrs and for the political project that we voted for to own our resources to fund the people's needs to actually come to fruition. The next major round of mobilizations called for will be July 27th, 28th, and 29th to coincide with Peruvian Independence Day.
Right? Because I guess Schools of Americas has a bad rep. So today it is the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. And that is what it is today. And I think this is primarily very important. Because I want to talk a bit about Cop City, but a lot of folks' familiarity with Cop City comes out of the struggle in Atlanta, right? Both Cop City and WINSEC exist in Georgia, right? Along with the Gilly program, which is training cops with Israelis. So all of those things are happening in Atlanta. But as you can see here with this map, cop cities have not just existed in Atlanta, it has spread across the US, right? So both institutions, the WINSEC and Cop City, they share rooted history and training of military and law enforcement personnel, particularly in Latin American countries, by the US government. Because they do say that about cop cities, that they do intend to not just train cops here, but make it an international training zone, especially in Atlanta. So while Cop City and the School of Americas, WINSEC now, they're distinct entities, they share common elements in terms of the training and the law enforcement practices. So Cop City aims to erase advanced urban environment and law enforcement, creates an advanced urban environment for law enforcement operations, incorporating surveillance systems. And this aligns with how we understand WINSEC, the historical focus on the training and the police personnel and tactics, intelligence gathering, and counterinsurgency. So the connections between these two institutions serve as a background for a necessary critical examination, but then also helps us connect our struggles. This brings us closer to understanding ourselves as part and parcel. This brings us closer to a politic of Nuestra America.
And so these are all extremely important to recognize, because these things, they're working in a way that they're trying to do these things in our face. And it's very important that we talk about them, we let people know what SOUTHCOM is, and also talk about Puerto Rico's colonial status and the fact that we were given citizenship in 1917 specifically to fight in U.S. wars, specifically in World War I. Most Puerto Ricans have family members who died in the Korean War, who died in the Vietnam War, because we were forced to go there because of the draft. And so I think that these are all very important things to name. And like I said, there's still 5 active military bases that we're demanding be shut down. It's not just the U.S. military, but it's also the FBI, the CIA, all of these different police forces. There's also police exchange programs where police from the United States will come to Puerto Rico to train Puerto Rican police to use the same tactics that they're using here. And we all know who else they train with in Israel. So they're training with the IOF, they're bringing back these tactics, and then they're also using them in Puerto Rico to quell protests.
And so with US SOUTHCOM and what we are prepared to do, we want to make sure that we take care of our responses are humane in this crisis that's currently happening. Certainly our Department of State and the diplomatic negotiations and solutions that they're working with other governments in the Caribbean and in the international community and with the UN. We hope that those will absolutely be successful at the end of the day.
So once again, thank you everyone for being here with us today, joining us for this very critical conversation and webinar. Thank you to all our panelists, to our interpreters, everyone in the background, everyone that's worked on this, and everyone for joining. No compromise, no retreat.